Now, the rest of the story. Everything seemed unreal. Everything seemed confusing when George was taken to the hospital. And then the shock wore off, and then came the pain. George owned a little Italian sports car, and he'd souped it up himself, of course, and now he'd almost been killed in it. But George loved cars. Growing up, he'd thought seriously about becoming a race car driver. In high school, his part-time job was a garage mechanic, but with graduation only days away, 18-year young George had cracked up on the road. His lungs had been crushed, and all at once, not even his survival was certain. Before the accident, George's life had been wonderfully simple. Born in Modesto, California, he was reared on his dad's ranch outside of town. The boy never concerned himself with grades, although he managed to get by at Downey High. What made his teen years worthwhile was rock and roll, and cherry cokes and penny loafers, and pointless, harmless fun. But you know, he had an image problem at first. In fact, some of his schoolmates thought he was a wimp. His locker buddy, Dennis Kemstra, was always snapping him with a towel after gym class. That's what wimps get. But George achieved an identity through cars. His favorite pastime was cruising McHenry Avenue in the evenings, just cruising up and down the street in his souped-up sports car, revving the engine at stoplights, honking at friends and waving at girls. George's dad had thought it was all a big waste of time, but the boy never felt more like a man than he did behind the wheel of that short, as they called them back then. Kind of interesting how growing up works, for example. It had been a smooth transition from comic books to hot rod magazines, and the fare to lousy grades, oh, that wouldn't matter, George reasoned, for a professional race car driver. But then, not long after his 18th birthday, in fact, George's car crashed, and in the hospital the boy died. The boy died, but the young man survived. Overnight, his taste for racing disappeared. By the time George left the hospital 3 months later, he'd already made plans to enter junior college. Oh, and something else. Still recuperating, he became interested in photography. And yet, no matter how much he changed, and he did change, no matter how far his new future would take him from Modesto, and it would take him far, George would remember his roots, and he would fondly recall the pranks and the fun and the frustrations and especially the marvelous, aimless innocence of his youth. And he would tell the world about it in a motion picture. You see, George became a movie maker. That's right, the George who produced Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark and so many more, George Lucas. But there was a first commercial film success, an unexpected one entitled American Graffiti. You remember that? So successful it spawned the television series Happy Days. Well, those were George's own happy days. Up there on the screen, the American teenage saga of a wimp who became a wheelman, who became a dream weaver, and now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars and Indiana Jones, founder of Lucasfilm, LucasArts, Industrial Light and Magic, and THX, had been nominated for 4 Academy Awards. Well, not too shabby for an independent filmmaker whose dream was to become a race car driver. George Walton Lucas Jr. was born on May 14, 1944, in Modesto, California. As a child, he was interested in comic books and science fiction. He especially loved the Flash Gordon serials. Well, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. In his mid-teens, George had a fascination for cars, but he had a motorcycle. George asked his father, George Lucas Sr., for a new car, and his father came through. George Sr. knew his son had a tendency for speed, and he bought something that he thought was much safer than a motorcycle. he bought his son a tiny yellow convertible Auto Bianchina with a small 2-cylinder engine similar to this one. It was by no means a race car. Well, not yet anyway. George beefed up his car's little engine, added a roll bar and a racing seatbelt, and he was sure his destiny as a race car driver was waiting for him just around the next corner. He had a nightly ritual of cruising the strip in Modesto, kind of like American Graffiti. He chased but rarely caught girls, and he drag raced and often won against other car enthusiasts. When George went to one of the 2 movie theaters in Modesto, he said, "I really didn't pay much attention. I was usually going to look for girls or goof off." On October 1st, 1961, George was among about 165 contestants in an autocross race which was held at the Turlock Airport. George may not have won the race, but he finished strong enough to be named as high finishing in the newspaper. He competed in other underground racing competitions as well, and his grades began to decline. George barely earned the grades needed to graduate high school. George Sr. was unhappy that George had no interest in taking over the family's stationery business. Can you imagine George Lucas in stationery? Well, no, because we wouldn't even know his name if he would have taken that route. At about 4:50 p.m. on Tuesday, June 12, 1961, 3 days before his high school graduation, George was driving east, heading back to his home at 821 Sylvan Road. 17-year-old Frank Ferrara was driving his Chevrolet Impala just behind George. As George slowed and began to turn left into his driveway, Frank decided to pass him. George's racing harness broke, and he was thrown from the car onto the pavement. His car flipped and rolled. Frank's car pushed George's car into a walnut tree. The car was crushed. Frank was uninjured, but George received numerous broken bones and bruised lungs. This photo of the remains of George's car appeared in the Modesto Bee on the day after the accident. During the months he spent recuperating from the wreck, George decided against becoming a race car driver, but he still loved fast cars. George studied anthropology, sociology, and literature at Modesto Junior College. When not in class, he began filming racing events. At one event, he befriended cinematographer Haskell Wexler, who saw some of the film George shot at the racing events. Haskell later said George had a very good eye and he thought visually. Haskell encouraged George to enroll at film school at the University of Southern California. There, George became friends with, who eventually became some of the biggest names in cinematic history, such as Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese. In 1967, he graduated with a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree. Most people argue that that car wreck changed the direction of George's life from racing cars to becoming interested in films. Well, that may be true in part, but George already had a deep interest in film. Earlier, I shared the quote in which George said, "When I went to the movies, I really didn't pay much attention. I was usually going to look for girls or goof off." Well, apparently, George paid more attention to movies than even he realized. In the Modesto Bee newspaper, Walter Scott had a full page devoted to what he called his personality parade. The premise behind Personality Parade was that readers could write in with questions about movie stars or films in general, and Scott would answer them in the newspaper. On June 3, 1962, just 9 days before George's car crash, his question appeared in Personality Parade. George asked, "Why did Alec Guinness play in such a film as A Majority of One with Rosalind Russell?" Walter answered with a quote directly from Alec Guinness, who said, "Simply for the money, $200,000. I'm not such an idealist as people think." In the film, which I must point out was a comedy, Alec Guinness played a Japanese businessman named Mr. Asano. He wore heavy makeup for the role and spoke a lot of what Japanese-American actor George Takei called incomprehensible gibberish in his attempt to sound Japanese. George Takei became famous for his role as Hikaru Sulu in the Star Trek franchise, but he had a small part in A Majority of One. Although the film was well received, it was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Cinematography and won 3 Golden Globe Awards for Best Motion Picture for Comedy, Best Actress in a Motion Picture, and Best Film Promoting International Understanding. Apparently George Lucas thought Alec Guinness was totally wrong for the part. At the time, George had no clue that he would cast Alec Guinness, a star he admired, in Star Wars 16 years later. Whereas Alec described Star Wars as fairy tale rubbish, George thought Alec's role in A Majority of One was also rubbish. Alec Guinness's Obi-Wan Kenobi is one of the most recognizable characters in film history. Not bad for fairy tale rubbish. Now just imagine for a moment that accident never took place. George may have become a successful race car driver whose name most of us would not recognize. We would not know about the Force. The word Jedi would have no meaning. One of the most famous villains in cinematic history, Darth Vader, would never have been created. There would be no Indiana Jones. Now, many people decided to study archaeology, anthropology, sociology, and other sciences because of this positive fictional character. Had George's racing seatbelt not snapped, had George not been thrown from his car, George would have been crushed and probably killed in the accident. The result would be the same, and cinematic history would not have been made, and I wouldn't have ended this episode by saying, "May the Force be with you." I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching, and now you know the rest of the story.